It is always difficult to know where to begin when approaching a subject like this. On one hand, there is the popular image that the internet has built, the one people whisper about on forums late at night or repeat in dimly lit rooms, hoping to spook their friends. On the other hand, there is the fact that this subject is not just some spooky story to pass around. It is bound to a culture, a history, and a set of beliefs that are not mine to twist or exploit. I have to admit, I hesitated even starting this. Talking about skinwalkers is not a casual act for the Dine people, the community more widely known as the Navajo. Within their worldview, even mentioning these beings is believed to risk drawing their attention. The very act of speaking their name carries weight. That alone should give you a sense of how far removed the internet versions are from the original, lived reality. The skinwalker, or Yinaldlushi in the Navajo language, is not just another cryptid to be thrown in alongside the Mothman or Bigfoot. It is not a campfire story designed for cheap scares. It is a deeply serious concept, tied to some of the most sensitive aspects of Navajo's spiritual life. To understand it, you have to forget much of what pop culture has fed you. Forget the creepy pasta illustrations of glowing-eyed beasts. Forget the endless chain of stories from people who claim to have seen something strange on a back road. Forget the exaggerated reality shows set on that infamous Utah ranch. What we need to do here is peel back those layers of distortion and ask where the real idea comes from and why it carries such power within its own cultural context. One of the most important things to understand right away is that skinwalkers are not tragic victims of a curse in the way European werewolves are often described. In old European folklore, the werewolf is often portrayed as a man who suffers a terrible fate, bitten or cursed, losing control of himself under the moon and waking up horrified at what he has done. The skinwalker is nothing like this. It is not an accident, not a curse imposed from outside, not a disease passed through a bite. It is a choice. It is a deliberate, conscious decision made by a human being to abandon the bonds of kinship, morality, and harmony in exchange for power. That fundamental distinction is what gives this figure its chilling weight. It is not the story of a man trapped within a monster. It is the story of a human who willingly becomes one. That choice is at the heart of the horror. The person who becomes a skinwalker is not losing themselves to an uncontrollable beast. They are shedding their humanity step by step, through acts that violate the deepest values of their society. The Navajo worldview places tremendous importance on balance, on harmony, on what is called hosho. This concept is difficult to translate in a single word. It carries meanings of beauty, order, harmony, and living in right relation with the world, the community, and oneself. Everything in traditional Navajo life is meant to maintain hosho. To live well is to preserve it. To fall into sickness, conflict, or misfortune is often seen as losing that balance. Healing ceremonies are designed to restore it. Every song, every prayer, every moral teaching is tied to it. The skinwalker represents the deliberate rejection of hosho. It is the active embrace of its opposite, a state of chaos and ugliness known as hochno. This is why the very idea of a skinwalker cuts so deeply. It is not just about an individual who has turned to something frightening. It is about someone who has turned against their own people, their own kin, their own world. It is betrayal in its purest form. Imagine the horror of believing that your neighbor, your cousin, or even your sibling could secretly be one. That is why the fear is so intimate. This is not some beast that comes howling from the woods. This is an enemy who might walk past you in daylight, greet you politely, and then prey upon you in the night with full knowledge of your vulnerabilities. When outsiders talk about skinwalkers, they often focus on the idea of shapeshifting, because that is the detail that translates most easily into pop culture horror. Yes, the lore does describe a skinwalker as someone who can assume animal forms, but the real horror is not that they might appear as a coyote or an owl. The horror is that the transformation reflects a human decision to take sacred knowledge meant for healing and invert it into something malicious. A hatali, a traditional healer, uses ceremony, herbs, songs, and stories to restore harmony. A skinwalker uses similar knowledge in reverse to destroy harmony. The same songs sung backwards, the same materials desecrated and poisoned, the same spiritual forces twisted toward harm. That is the violation. That is what makes it terrifying. And this is also why speaking about it is taboo. In many traditional teachings, to describe evil in detail is to risk invoking it. To speak of these acts openly is to invite their attention. Outsiders have no sense of this risk. That is why so much of what you see online feels off. It is not just inaccurate, it is disrespectful, because it treats a subject of genuine fear and taboo as if it were just another urban legend. People who belong to the culture do not casually trade skinwalker stories around a campfire. They avoid the topic altogether unless it is necessary, and even then it is spoken of with caution and gravity. As we move forward through this exploration, that is the spirit I want to carry. This is not an exposé, not a horror story for cheap thrills. This is a careful attempt to separate fact from distortion, to understand why this figure matters and what it means. If you expect a list of spooky roadside encounters, you will be disappointed. But if you are willing to listen carefully, to sit with the unease that comes from seeing how human choices can lead to unthinkable betrayal, then perhaps you will come away with a clearer sense of why the Skinwalker occupies such a powerful place in Navajo thought. For now, hold on to that one idea. The Skinwalker is not a victim of fate, it is not a man cursed against his will. It is a person who looked at the order of the world, saw the bonds of kinship and community, and chose to sever them. It is not the beast that horrifies. It is the human being who remains inside, remembering everything, regretting nothing, and using knowledge meant for harmony to cultivate fear. That, more than any glowing eyes or animal forms, is what makes this figure endure as one of the most unsettling in all of North American lore. When most people outside the community first hear the word Skinwalker, what they imagine is something closer to a Hollywood monster. It is easy to see why. Movies and shows have trained us to expect certain kinds of monsters, and when a new name enters the conversation, people quickly plug it into the familiar patterns. If you say Skinwalker to someone who has never studied Navajo culture, they will probably picture a werewolf with desert dust on its fur, or maybe a zombie-like figure that prowls lonely highways. Those images are comfortable, in a way. They fit into categories we already know, but the real thing does not fit those categories. That mismatch between the familiar pop culture monster and the actual Navajo figure is at the heart of the confusion. To understand why the real concept is so disturbing, it helps to think about the difference between tragedy and intent. In European stories about werewolves, the monster is often tragic. A man is bitten or cursed. He transforms under the full moon. He may kill and destroy, but then he wakes horrified at the blood on his hands. The story invites pity. The monster is a victim of forces beyond his control. When you carry that framework into the idea of the Skinwalker, it does not work, because here the transformation is not something inflicted, it is something chosen. This detail cannot be overstated. A Skinwalker is a person who looks at their life, their community, their spiritual obligations and decides to cast them aside. They choose to break the most sacred bonds for the sake of acquiring power. The horror is not that they are trapped inside a beast. The horror is that they are fully aware of what they are doing. They calculate, they remember, they relish their choices. The violence they commit is not mindless rage, it is premeditated cruelty. That is what makes this figure chilling. It is not a wild animal. It is a predator with human agency. Imagine the psychological weight of believing that someone in your community, someone who shares your landscape and customs, has deliberately chosen to become this enemy. That is what sets the Skinwalker apart from the werewolf. It is not the fur or the claws or the animal form that makes it terrifying. It is the betrayal. It is the knowledge that the face beneath the animal guise is not that of a stranger. It is someone who might have shared food with you, someone who might know your name, your family, your weaknesses. The idea of betrayal is central here. Within Navajo culture, kinship is sacred. Relationships bind the world together. Every person is part of an intricate web of obligations and care. Family ties extend outward into community ties, and together they form the structure that keeps Hazo, or harmony, intact. When someone becomes a Skinwalker, they deliberately cut those ties. The act is not just against the victim, it is against the whole system of balance. That is why the fear is so intimate. You cannot simply look outside to some distant beast. You have to look inward, at the possibility that harm comes from within. Outsiders who only know the monster version often miss this subtlety. They see the shape-shifting and the glowing eyes and stop there. But the terror is not in the spectacle. It is in the knowledge that the evil is fully human. A skinwalker is not compelled by some curse. They are motivated by grudges, jealousy, or the pursuit of selfish gain. The tools they use are not random either. They often use intimate knowledge of the victim. They know how to make their presence felt in ways that are deeply personal. They may poison livestock, whisper a name in the night, or tap on a window with an eerie precision that reveals how well they understand their target. This is psychological warfare, not random mayhem. Consider the effect this has on the victims. It is not just physical harm, it is the dismantling of safety itself. A person begins to question every sound at night, every misfortune, every sickness. Was it natural or was it caused by someone who secretly turned against them? The world that once felt secure becomes unstable, home becomes unfamiliar, community becomes suspicious. This is the true damage. The goal is not only to harm but to create a climate of constant fear and doubt. That fear spreads through silence. Because the topic is taboo, people do not casually talk about it. The silence itself feeds the unease. You may notice that when outsiders talk about skinwalkers, they speak freely, piling on sensational details and exaggerations. But within Navajo culture, the less said the better. There is a belief that speaking too openly invites attention, so people avoid the subject unless it is absolutely necessary. That avoidance reinforces how dangerous it is believed to be. Imagine growing up in an environment where even saying the name aloud feels risky. That kind of atmosphere shapes how deeply the fear is felt. This taboo also explains why so much misinformation spreads outside the community. Outsiders fill the silence with their own inventions. Internet stories substitute cheap scares for real cultural context. Paranormal shows spin tales of glowing creatures caught on blurry cameras. Online forums circulate second-hand stories that sound like ghost tales. None of that reflects the lived understanding. But because the real stories are not shared openly, the fakes rush to take their place. The result is a caricature that obscures the truth. And yet the real truth, as difficult as it is to approach, is much more unsettling. The skinwalker is not an outsider monster, but an insider traitor. It is a figure defined not by tragic loss of control, but by deliberate betrayal. That distinction changes everything. It moves the fear from the external to the internal. It forces you to consider not what strange beast lurks beyond the desert hills, but what choices your neighbor, your cousin, or even you yourself might be capable of making. This is the difference between a campfire story and a cultural terror. The werewolf howls at the moon, the vampire stalks in the night, but these are creatures of passion and compulsion. The skinwalker is something else entirely. It is a human with the full memory of what they have done, acting with intention, breaking every sacred bond for the sake of their own gain. That is the reason why the very mention of them is avoided. It is not superstition alone. It is an acknowledgement of the human potential for corruption and the deep unease that comes with knowing that evil is not always outside, but sometimes arises from within. Hold on to that thought, because as we continue this journey, we will need to explore how this choice to abandon humanity is made, what paths are taken, and what it means for a culture built on harmony to face the deliberate inversion of all its values. When you hear that a skinwalker is created through choice, not by curse, the natural question is what path leads someone there. This is where things begin to cross into material that is extremely sensitive. Accounts describe the journey to becoming a skinwalker as the witchery way, a path of learning that mirrors the knowledge of healers but twists it toward destruction. It is important to remember that even speaking of this is considered dangerous, and that is why details are often vague or spoken in hushed tones. What is clear is that the transition from ordinary person to skinwalker is marked by acts that are shocking violations of cultural values. To understand this, imagine the role of a hata'ali, the healer. A healer spends years memorizing songs, prayers, and ceremonies. They are responsible for maintaining balance within their community. Their work is exhausting, disciplined, and entirely devoted to restoration. In contrast, the person who chooses the witchery way takes pieces of this same knowledge and uses it in reverse. Songs are sung backwards, sacred items are corrupted, ceremonies that would normally heal are deliberately inverted to harm. The same tools that restore Hozho are transformed into weapons that create Hoch-Ho, the state of chaos. Accounts speak of initiation rituals. Someone who desires this path must approach others who already walk it. They seek out secret gatherings, often described as taking place in remote canyons or caves under cover of night. These are not public events. They are clandestine and hidden for obvious reasons. The initiate must prove themselves. Often the first act is to sacrifice something of personal or familial importance. This can take the form of giving up a cherished item, but the most extreme accounts describe offering a lock of a relative's hair, which carries strong spiritual significance. That act alone is a symbolic severing of family bonds. It is a declaration that personal gain is more important than kinship. Once this offering is made, the education begins. The initiate learns how to twist what is sacred. They are taught to desecrate holy objects, to corrupt natural medicines into poisons, to use bones of the dead in ceremonies that pervert their intended purpose. This process strips away humanity piece by piece. Each act is a step further from balance. The learning is not only about technical skill, it is also about moral erosion. The more taboos one breaks, the easier it becomes to continue. The journey is not a single leap but a long descent, and by the end, the initiate has been reshaped into someone capable of cruelty. The culmination of this journey is described in whispers. To fully become a skinwalker, one must commit the ultimate betrayal. The act that seals the transformation is the killing of a close blood relative, often a sibling. This is not murder for convenience. It is murder as ritual. It is murder as initiation. By destroying the most sacred bond of kinship, the person permanently severs themselves from Hozho. They take the life force of their relative into themselves, creating a vacuum in the web of relations and filling it with their own corrupted power. It is an act of profound narcissism, the elevation of the self through the destruction of the closest possible tie. When you think about this from within the cultural framework, the horror becomes clear. The concept of K, which refers to the intricate bonds of kinship that extend through Navajo life, is not a simple matter of family. It is the organizing principle of the universe. It defines obligations, respect, and the way one relates to every other being. To destroy it deliberately by killing a sibling is to declare war on the very structure that holds the world together. It is the antithesis of everything valued. This is why the figure of the skinwalker is so feared. It is not just that they can shift into animal forms. It is that their power is built on the most intimate betrayal imaginable. For outsiders, this detail is often sensationalized. People repeat it as if it were just another piece of trivia, a gruesome fact to add color to a scary story. But for the people whose culture holds this belief, it is not entertainment. It is the ultimate warning about what happens when a person abandons their obligations and embraces selfishness at the expense of all else. It is the darkest possible mirror of human potential. What makes this even more unsettling is that the act does not erase the human mind. The person does not vanish into a beast. They remain themselves, with all their memories and intelligence intact. But now that intelligence is bent entirely toward malice. They know what they have done. They carry the memory of the betrayal, and instead of regret, they embrace it as the foundation of their new existence. That is why skinwalkers are said to be calculating. They do not lash out blindly. They plan, they strategize, they torment with precision. Think about how different this is from the typical monster story. In most traditions, the scariest part is the uncontrollable transformation. The man who does not want to harm anyone but cannot stop himself when the full moon rises. The vampire who is cursed to drink blood. These stories invite sympathy. You can pity the victim who has lost control. The skinwalker demands no pity. The horror is not in losing control but in seizing it fully. It is in choosing to harm and knowing exactly what you are doing. That is what makes the figure linger in the imagination. It is also worth remembering how much of this information comes through anthropological work and second-hand accounts. Because the subject is taboo, details are rarely given openly. That creates gaps, and outsiders often rush to fill those gaps with invention. They take kernels of truth and exaggerate them into grotesque caricatures. They focus on the most shocking details and ignore the deeper meaning. That is why it is important to approach this subject carefully. The point is not to wallow in gruesome acts. The point is to understand why this concept exists and what it represents. The idea of choosing to abandon balance, of deliberately breaking bonds of kinship, of taking knowledge meant for healing and twisting it toward harm, these are themes that resonate beyond the culture itself. They speak to universal fears about what people are capable of when they turn away from community and morality. They remind us that evil is not always an outside force that attacks us. Sometimes it is a choice made by someone we know. Sometimes it is a betrayal that comes from within. And so, as disturbing as it is, the path to becoming a skinwalker is not just a spooky legend. It is a reflection of the deepest fears about human choice. It is the embodiment of what happens when someone willingly walks away from harmony and embraces destruction. That is why this figure endures, why it is whispered about with dread, and why it remains one of the most powerful and terrifying symbols in North American lore. When most people think of monsters, they picture something that looks inhuman from the start: a clawed beast, a scaled creature, a shadow with glowing eyes. With skinwalkers, the unsettling part is that they look like people. They are people. That is the thread that makes this so disturbing, because the monster is not separate from humanity, it is hiding within it. The ability to take on animal forms is what draws the attention of outsiders, but it is important to understand how this power is understood in the cultural context. Shapeshifting is not just a magical trick, it is rooted in knowledge. A healer might use the skin of an animal for ceremonial purposes, a way of connecting with the qualities that animal represents. In the hands of a healer, this is a respectful act done in harmony with tradition. In the hands of a skinwalker, it is an act of desecration. By wearing the skin of an animal, they take on its form, its movements, its silhouette. Stories describe them appearing as coyotes, owls, foxes, wolves, or even larger creatures. But the important detail is that these forms are masks. Beneath the animal is always a human being who chose this path. Imagine walking alone at night on the edges of a desert town. You see a coyote standing too still, watching from a distance. Something about it feels wrong. Maybe it is the way its eyes follow you. Maybe it is that it does not move like other animals do. That is the kind of moment that inspires fear. Not because a coyote itself is terrifying, but because the possibility lingers that it is not truly an animal at all. That uncertainty, the inability to trust your own senses, is part of what makes skinwalker lore so powerful. These animal forms are not limited to simple disguise. Accounts suggest that the skinwalker can move with unnatural speed or endurance, using the borrowed shape as a way of stalking prey. The idea is not to vanish into the wilderness, but to use the form strategically. They might linger near a home, watching silently. They might follow someone for miles, appearing at the edges of vision again and again, never close enough to confirm, but never far enough to forget. This is not random. It is calculated psychological pressure. The goal is to wear the victim down, to make them question what is real. Another element often mentioned is mimicry. A skinwalker may use a stolen voice to call out in the darkness, pretending to be a child, a relative, or even an animal in distress. Imagine hearing your own name whispered outside your window when you know no one should be there. Imagine hearing a baby crying in the distance when you know there are no children nearby. These tactics exploit intimate knowledge of the victim, using what is familiar as a weapon. That is what makes them terrifying. Not just that they can change shape, but that they use that ability to get under your skin, to make your home and your senses feel unreliable. This calculated cruelty is one of the clearest distinctions between skinwalker lore and other shapeshifter myths. In many traditions, the shapeshifter is simply a being of transformation, sometimes even a trickster figure. But here the transformation is a tool of personal malice. It is a means of pursuing grudges, spreading fear, or causing illness. It is never neutral, and it is never detached from human intent. That is why descriptions of skinwalkers often emphasize not just their appearance but their behavior. They are not beasts acting on instinct. They are people using every ounce of knowledge and cunning to inflict pain. Consider how different this is from the pop culture image of a monster. On the internet, the Skinwalker has become a spooky figure in roadside stories, a beast with glowing eyes that leaps in front of cars or lurks in the woods. While those images are unsettling, they strip away the deeper meaning. The true horror is not a jump scare on a lonely highway. The true horror is the realization that someone close to you might deliberately use intimate knowledge and sacred practices in order to destroy your peace of mind. That betrayal cuts much deeper than any animal shape ever could. In many accounts, the presence of a skinwalker is less about a direct attack and more about a campaign of slow erosion. They do not need to leap from the shadows with claws, they only need to unsettle. A knock on the wall in the middle of the night, a voice calling from outside, an animal lingering too long at the edge of vision. Each event on its own might be explained away. A tree branch, a stray dog, a trick of the wind. But together, they form a pattern of fear that cannot be easily dismissed. That is the strategy. To make the familiar world feel wrong. The goal of these acts is often described as dismantling Hozho. By creating fear, suspicion, and disorder, the skinwalker undermines the very balance that holds life together. The sickness caused may be physical, but just as often it is psychological. Anxiety, paranoia, and mistrust begin to spread. In a culture where harmony and relationship are the foundation of life, this kind of disruption is devastating. The victim is not only weakened individually, but their family and community ties are strained as well. This ripple effect is part of what makes the skinwalker such a powerful symbol of danger. It is also important to remember that these descriptions are not just meant to frighten, they serve as warnings. They remind people of the importance of protecting relationships, of maintaining balance, of avoiding selfishness. The skinwalker is the embodiment of what happens when someone does the opposite. They are a living lesson in the consequences of abandoning community for personal gain. The stories are not entertainment in the way ghost stories are. They are cultural reminders, reinforcing values by showing what happens when those values are shattered. So when outsiders focus only on the dramatic imagery of glowing eyes and animal forms, they miss the heart of the story. The power of the skinwalker is not just in what it looks like, it is in what it represents. It is a human being who has taken everything meant for good and inverted it into something meant for harm. The shapeshifting is only the surface. The real fear lies beneath, in the deliberate betrayal and the knowledge that the monster is not a stranger from outside but someone within the community who has chosen this path. This understanding changes the way we hear the stories. What might sound like simple folklore about strange animals becomes instead a reflection of the deepest human fears, the fear of betrayal. The fear of losing trust in what is familiar. The fear that someone you know might choose to use their knowledge not to heal but to harm. These are fears that resonate universally, even for those outside the culture. They are reminders that evil is not always a distant creature lurking in the woods. Sometimes it is the person next to you, wearing a mask, calculating every move, and taking pleasure in your fear. When you look closely at how the skinwalker is described, the theme that keeps appearing is intimacy. This is not an enemy that exists far away, haunting some distant land that you will never visit. It is an enemy that could be right beside you, hidden in plain sight. That closeness is what makes it terrifying. The betrayal is personal, and the fear seeps into everyday life. It is not a story about avoiding cursed forests or keeping away from old ruins. It is about questioning the safety of your own home and the trustworthiness of your own community. Within many traditions, evil is imagined as something external, a devil figure that tempts from outside, or a monster that stalks the edges of civilization. The skinwalker is different because it is born from within. It is a person you may know, someone who has lived in the same community, someone who may have once been trusted. They walk the same paths, use the same language, share the same stories. That is why the fear is described as intimate. It is not just about the threat of physical harm, but about the violation of trust at the deepest possible level. Think of how unsettling it is to realize that a neighbor, a relative, or a friend might secretly harbor such a hidden life. The possibility is always there in the back of the mind, and because the subject is taboo, it cannot be openly discussed. The silence makes the suspicion worse. If something strange happens, if misfortune strikes, if illness spreads unexpectedly, there may be whispers, but there is rarely open confrontation. The fear festers quietly. That quietness is part of what makes it unbearable. One of the ways this fear shows itself is through the kinds of acts attributed to skinwalkers. They do not simply attack directly like a wild animal would. Instead, they target what you rely on most. A herd animal that falls sick suddenly. A family member who develops a wasting illness that doctors cannot explain. Livestock poisoned in the night. Crops failing in strange patterns. These are the kinds of events that slowly wear down confidence. You do not know if they are natural or caused by someone with hidden malice. That uncertainty is what keeps people awake at night, questioning every sound, every shadow, every misfortune. This form of attack is effective because it destabilizes daily life. Imagine waking up each day wondering if your food has been tampered with, if your water is safe, if the sudden cough of your child is something natural or something placed upon them by design. The constant questioning erodes the sense of security. It makes home itself feel unsafe. And once home feels unsafe, there is no place left to retreat. That is the heart of the psychological terror. The familiar becomes hostile, the trusted becomes suspect. The stories about skinwalkers often emphasize this inversion of normal life, a voice outside the window that sounds like someone you know, but you realize that person could not possibly be there. Footsteps on the roof when there is no reason anyone should be walking there. A scratching at the door at an hour when everyone else is asleep. Each detail on its own might be explained away, but when they happen repeatedly, they create a climate of dread. The fear is not in one single shocking moment. It is in the slow accumulation of experiences that make the ordinary world feel wrong. Because of this, the skinwalker does not only represent a danger to individuals, but to the entire social fabric. When trust breaks down, suspicion spreads. If you believe harm could come from someone close, then every relationship becomes vulnerable. Families begin to doubt each other. Communities fracture under the pressure of suspicion. The damage is not only physical or psychological, it is social. Harmony, which is the foundation of the culture, is undermined by mistrust. That is why healers are seen as so important. The role of the hatali is not only to cure illness, but to restore balance to relationships. When sickness or misfortune strikes, the healer works to identify the cause and re-establish household. If the cause is believed to be witchcraft, the task becomes even more delicate. The ceremonies are designed to protect and strengthen the victim, to shield them from further harm, and to restore their confidence in the safety of the world. These ceremonies can last for days, involving songs, prayers, sand paintings, and herbal medicines. They are immense undertakings, but they serve as a counterweight to the destruction caused by witchery. This contrast between healer and skinwalker is stark. Both have knowledge of herbs, songs, and ceremonies. Both have studied deeply, but one uses that knowledge to heal, the other to harm. This is part of what makes the skinwalker so frightening. They are not outsiders with alien powers. They are insiders who took the same knowledge that preserves life and twisted it for destruction. The same understanding of plants that could save someone from illness can also be turned into poison. The same sacred songs that restore harmony can also be corrupted to bring chaos. That inversion is what creates such profound unease. It also raises uncomfortable questions about human nature. If knowledge itself is neutral, then what matters most is the intent of the person who holds it. The healer and the skinwalker might begin with the same training, but one walks toward harmony, while the other walks toward betrayal. This is not a story about outside forces taking control of someone. It is a story about choices, about what direction a person decides to take. That is why the skinwalker becomes a symbol not only of fear but of moral failure. And perhaps that is why outsiders are so often drawn to the skinwalker myth. There is something universally unsettling about the idea of the trusted figure turned traitor. In other traditions, this appears as the corrupted priest, the backstabbing friend, the family member who betrays you for personal gain. In the skinwalker, that idea takes its most extreme form. The betrayal is not metaphorical, it is literal and spiritual. a rejection of everything sacred in favor of power. That resonates because it points to something everyone fears, the idea that evil does not need to come from outside. It can arise from the people closest to us. As we continue through these accounts, it becomes clear that the power of the Skinwalker is not measured only in their supernatural abilities. It is measured in the fear they create and the trust they destroy. Their attacks may be invisible, their presence unspoken, but the impact is lasting. They make the world feel unstable. They make every relationship feel uncertain. They transform the safe into the dangerous. And because of that, they endure as one of the most frightening figures in North American lore, not as monsters from a distant myth, but as symbols of what happens when someone chooses betrayal over harmony. When people outside the culture talk about skinwalkers, the first detail they usually focus on is the ability to shapeshift. They imagine it as a purely physical trick, a way of wearing an animal body like a mask. But what often gets lost is the deeper meaning. In Navajo tradition, animals are not just creatures of the wilderness. They carry symbolic weight. Each one has traits that can guide, protect, or instruct. A healer may call on the qualities of certain animals during ceremony, using their presence as a way to restore balance. In that context, the relationship is one of respect, but when a skinwalker takes on an animal form, it is not respectful. It is theft. It is a violation of what is sacred. The animal skins worn by a skinwalker are not costumes in the playful sense. They are deliberate tools of transformation. By wearing the skin of a coyote or an owl, the person invokes its form in a corrupted way. They use what was once sacred knowledge as a weapon. This inversion is part of what makes the idea frightening. The skinwalker does not create something new. They take what is familiar and twist it into something hostile. That is why the sight of an animal behaving strangely can be so unsettling. It is not just about fear of the unknown. It is about fear that the known has been corrupted. Accounts describe skinwalkers appearing as coyotes that do not move naturally, or owls that linger too close to homes, staring too long. The discomfort lies not in the animal itself, but in the way it seems wrong, almost human in its intent. Imagine walking home at dusk and noticing a coyote sitting at the edge of the road. It does not run when you approach. It does not act skittish the way most wild animals would. Instead, it just stares, its head tilted slightly, as if studying you. You continue walking, and when you glance back, it is still there, following at a distance. That kind of encounter is not dramatic in a cinematic sense, but it is deeply unnerving. The mimicry is perhaps even more disturbing than the animal forms. Skinwalkers are said to call out in voices that sound like those of familiar people. They may imitate the cry of a baby, the laughter of a child, or the voice of a relative calling your name. The intent is always the same: to lure, to unsettle, to draw you into a state of vulnerability. Imagine hearing your own name whispered outside your door when you know no one else should be there. The sound cuts through every rational explanation because it is so specific, so personal. That is not a random scare. That is a calculated strike at your sense of safety. What makes these tactics effective is not the spectacle but the slow erosion of trust. Each incident might be explained away on its own. An animal could be acting strangely. A voice could be the wind. A sound at night could be the house settling, but the repetition begins to eat away at certainty. After enough nights of hearing footsteps outside, or after seeing the same strange animal too many times, doubt sets in. The ordinary world begins to feel unreliable. That is the true terror, not a single shocking event but the gradual dismantling of your ability to trust your own senses. This kind of psychological pressure is devastating in a community where trust and harmony are essential. If you cannot trust the land, the animals, or even the voices of your loved ones, then where is safety to be found? That is the strategy of the skinwalker. Their violence is not just physical. It is spiritual and social. By turning the ordinary into a source of fear, they undermine the foundation of daily life. Home no longer feels safe. Community no longer feels reliable. Every sound, every shadow becomes a potential threat. There are stories of skinwalkers running alongside cars at impossible speeds, of figures glimpsed in the periphery that vanish when approached, of animals with eyes that reflect light like mirrors instead of the way real animals do. These details are memorable because they are visual, easy to repeat, easy to dramatize. But what matters is the effect they have on the people who witness them. The fear is not only in the moment of seeing, it lingers afterward, coloring every future experience. Once you have seen something you cannot explain, you begin to question everything else. This lingering fear can become its own form of illness. Stress, sleeplessness, and anxiety take their toll. A person who believes they are being targeted by a skinwalker may lose appetite, may become withdrawn, may stop trusting those around them. This is not a small matter. It spreads outward, touching their family and their community. Others may begin to worry that they too are being targeted. Suspicion grows, and the harmony that is so vital to Navajo life begins to fray. This ripple effect is part of the destructive power attributed to skinwalkers. The taboo against speaking openly about them reinforces this fear. If you cannot discuss what you are experiencing, then you carry the burden alone. Silence allows suspicion to grow unchecked. In contrast, ceremonies performed by healers are communal. They involve family and community members coming together to support the afflicted person. In this way, the healer works not only on the illness or the fear, but also on the bonds that hold people together. The skinwalker isolates, while the healer unites. The contrast could not be more stark. It is worth remembering that much of the popular imagery surrounding skinwalkers comes from outsiders who have taken these stories and reshaped them into entertainment. Paranormal television shows, internet stories, and roadside legends often exaggerate or simplify the lore. They focus on glowing eyes, on dramatic encounters, on confrontations that look good on camera. What they miss is the slow, suffocating dread that comes from believing that someone close to you has turned their knowledge into a weapon against you. The real fear is quieter, more personal, and far more devastating than any jump scare. This is why the subject is handled with caution by those within the culture. To treat it as a mere story is to miss its purpose. It is not only about fear. It is about warning, about reinforcing the importance of maintaining harmony, about showing the consequences of choosing selfishness over community. The figure of the skinwalker embodies everything that threatens Hosho. It is the complete inversion of the values that sustain life. That is why it endures, not just as a monster in the shadows, but as a living symbol of betrayal, corruption, and the dangers of abandoning balance. And so, when we hear accounts of strange animals behaving oddly, or voices calling from the night, it is important to listen not only to the surface details, but to the underlying meaning. These stories remind us that the most frightening monsters are not always the ones with claws and fangs. Sometimes the true horror is the human mind that chooses to turn sacred knowledge into a weapon, that chooses to dismantle harmony instead of preserving it. That is the essence of the skinwalker, and it is why even speaking of them requires caution and respect. As much as the skinwalker belongs to Navajo tradition, it has also become entangled with modern stories told far outside that culture. One of the most famous of these is the place known as Skinwalker Ranch in Utah. For many people who have never studied Navajo belief, this ranch is their first introduction to the word. They hear stories of glowing creatures, strange lights in the sky, and mysterious happenings on the property. Entire television shows have been built around it. But the connection between those tales and the traditional concept of the skinwalker is far more complicated than most viewers realize. The ranch sits in the Uinta Basin, a place with its own layered history. Long before it became the subject of paranormal fascination, it was land tied to the Ute people. The Navajo and the Ute have their own complex histories with one another, including stories of conflict and distrust. Some say the land carries a legacy of these tensions, a background that has fueled later rumors. In the 1990s, a family who bought the property began to report bizarre occurrences. Their stories included livestock mutilations, unidentified flying objects, and encounters with strange creatures that did not seem to belong to any known species. When the media picked up these stories, they quickly latched onto the word skinwalker. It became a convenient label, a way to link the property to a figure already surrounded by mystery. From that moment on, the name Skinwalker Ranch stuck, and the legend grew. Books were written, paranormal investigators arrived. The History Channel eventually turned it into an ongoing series. For the general public, this was entertainment. But for the Navajo, the use of the word was troubling. The Skinwalker was never meant to be a piece of pop culture. It was not supposed to be a spectacle for television ratings. The mismatch between the traditional figure and the media version highlights how easily stories can be distorted. The ranch tales often describe huge wolves that do not die when shot, or glowing humanoid creatures lurking near the tree line. These details play well on camera. They are visual, dramatic, and easy to sensationalize, but they strip away the deeper meaning of the Skinwalker. In Navajo tradition, the Skinwalker is not simply a monster haunting a piece of land. It is a person who has chosen betrayal. The horror lies in the intimacy of that choice, not in blurry footage of glowing shapes. This distortion matters because it shapes how outsiders understand the subject. When the public hears the word Skinwalker, they think of Utah ranches, alien craft, and paranormal thrillers. They rarely think of the actual cultural context of the role of kinship, harmony, and betrayal. The result is that the authentic figure is erased, replaced by a caricature. For the Navajo, this is not just inaccurate, it is disrespectful. Speaking of skinwalkers is already taboo, already risky. To take that word and attach it to television shows about aliens and cryptids is to trivialize something that carries deep cultural weight. At the same time, the popularity of the ranch shows how fascinated people are by the idea of boundaries breaking down. The stories mix together legends of witches, accounts of unidentified aerial phenomena, tales of strange animals, and government research. It becomes a grab bag of everything paranormal. That is appealing to audiences who want spectacle, but it also blurs the line between tradition and invention. It becomes harder to know what belongs to authentic belief and what was added for dramatic effect. There is an irony here. The Skinwalker, as understood by the Navajo, is terrifying precisely because it is not spectacle. It is quiet, it is intimate, it works through betrayal and slow erosion of trust. The ranch version is the opposite. It is flashy, packed with fireworks of paranormal phenomena. The two could not be more different. One spreads fear through silence, the other thrives on constant retelling. Yet because the ranch is more visible, more people know that version. It overshadows the original, even though it shares only the name. This situation raises larger questions about how indigenous stories are treated in popular culture. Too often they are taken without context, reshaped into entertainment, and sold back to the public as horror or science fiction. The original meaning is lost. What was once a serious, taboo subject becomes a brand, a logo, a storyline. The danger is not just misrepresentation, but erasure. If enough people believe that the Skinwalker is nothing more than a glowing beast on a Utah ranch, then the true depth of the concept is hidden. The cultural lesson about betrayal and harmony disappears, replaced by another monster for late-night television. And yet, there is also a kind of echo between the two versions. Both reflect fear of the familiar turning strange. In the Navajo context, it is the neighbor or the relative who chooses evil. In the ranch stories, it is the land itself that becomes unstable, the sky above that behaves in ways it should not, both unsettle by making the ordinary world unreliable. But only one is rooted in a living culture with deep meaning. The other is a collage of paranormal tropes layered onto a single piece of property. For those who want to understand the Skinwalker with respect, it is important to make this distinction. To study the ranch is to study a modern paranormal phenomenon, something that belongs to the world of entertainment and speculation. To study the Skinwalker as part of Navajo tradition is to confront a figure that carries heavy taboo, one that represents profound betrayal and corruption. They are not the same, and treating them as if they were collapses the difference between cultural teaching and pop spectacle. That difference also shapes how people react. Viewers of paranormal television might feel a thrill, a temporary scare, then move on. But for those raised within the culture, the fear is not entertainment. It is something that lingers, something that shapes behavior, something that silences conversation. That is why caution is needed. To speak about the Skinwalker is to touch on something more serious than a horror story. It is to acknowledge a figure that embodies the deepest fears about human choice and the fragility of trust. So when we hear about Skinwalker Ranch, it is worth remembering that what is being sold there is not the same as what is feared in Navajo tradition. One is a spectacle of glowing shapes and flying objects. The other is the intimate terror of betrayal within a community. To confuse them is to lose sight of the meaning. To separate them is to begin to understand. The ranch may continue to attract attention, drawing in those fascinated by the paranormal. But the traditional figure endures with or without cameras, whispered about carefully, avoided in casual conversation, feared not for its spectacle but for its silence. That is the contrast we must hold on to. The noise of entertainment on one side and the heavy silence of taboo on the other. One belongs to television. The other belongs to a people whose worldview is built on balance, and who know that the greatest horror is not always found in strange lights in the sky, but in the choices made by human beings who turn against everything sacred. To understand why the figure of the Skinwalker is so powerful, you have to see it against the backdrop of Navajo values. At the center of those values is the concept of hosho, a word that carries meanings of beauty, harmony, balance, and order. It is more than just a philosophy. It is a way of life. Every prayer, every ceremony, every act of generosity is part of maintaining hosho. It is not a permanent state achieved once and held forever. It is a constant practice, something that requires attention and renewal every day. To live well is to live in hosho. This idea is not only about personal health or happiness, it extends outward into the community and the world itself. Harmony with family, with neighbors, with the land, with the seasons, all of these are part of hosho. To fall into illness, misfortune, or conflict is to fall out of balance. The role of healers is to restore it. The songs, the stories, the ceremonies are all ways of re-establishing the delicate order that keeps life whole. The Skinwalker is terrifying because it is the embodiment of the opposite. It represents hoxmo, a state of chaos, disorder, and ugliness. When someone becomes a Skinwalker, they do not simply gain strange powers. They become a living rejection of hosho. Every act they commit works to undermine harmony. Where a healer sings to restore, the Skinwalker sings to destroy. Where a healer uses plants to heal, the Skinwalker uses them to poison. Where a healer reinforces kinship, the Skinwalker severs it. The contrast could not be greater. This is why the very idea of such a person is horrifying. It is not just a danger to individuals, it is a danger to the entire order of life. Consider the role of a healer during a ceremony. The healer memorizes thousands of lines of stories, songs, and prayers. They know the precise order in which to perform them. They use sand paintings, herbs, and chants to restore harmony to a patient and their family. The work is exhausting, requiring years of training and discipline. The healer is the ultimate force for good, the restorer of balance. Now imagine that same knowledge taken by someone who chooses betrayal. Imagine each song sung backwards, each sacred tool turned into a weapon, each piece of wisdom used to harm instead of heal. That is the Skinwalker. It is the inversion of everything the healer stands for. This inversion strikes at the very heart of cultural survival. Hosho is not an abstract idea. It is what allows life to flourish in a difficult landscape. It is what sustains families through hardship. It is what holds communities together. Without it, everything begins to unravel. The Skinwalker does not just attack a victim, it attacks the foundation that keeps the community alive. That is why it is feared so deeply. It represents not just harm but collapse, not just danger but betrayal of everything sacred. When you think of it this way, the Skinwalker is not only a monster, it is a symbol. It is the living embodiment of what happens when harmony is abandoned. It shows what it looks like when someone chooses selfishness over community, destruction over creation, ugliness over beauty. In that sense, it serves as a warning. To tell stories of the Skinwalker is to remind people of what must be avoided. The fear is not only for the acts the Skinwalker might commit. The fear is for what it represents, the possibility that anyone could make the same choice if they stray too far from balance. This symbolic weight also explains why the subject is taboo. Speaking too much of the Skinwalker risks giving it power. Dwelling on ugliness invites ugliness. To maintain hosho, people avoid naming what undermines it. Silence becomes a way of protecting the balance. Outsiders often interpret this silence as secrecy or mystery, but within the culture, It is a deliberate act of preservation. Not everything is meant to be spoken freely. Some knowledge is dangerous, not because it is magical in a fantasy sense, but because words shape thought, and thought shapes action. The power of Hosho is also psychological. To be in balance is to feel protected, integrated, and whole. It is to feel that your inner world and outer world align. This sense of security gives strength. The Skinwalker disrupts that by making the familiar feel alien. By tapping on windows, by whispering names in the night, by appearing in the forms of animals, the Skinwalker erodes that feeling of safety. Once balance is lost, illness, conflict, and misfortune follow. That is why the figure is feared not only as a physical threat but as a spiritual one. It is worth pausing to recognize how profound this worldview is. In many cultures, evil is imagined as a separate force, an outside enemy. In Navajo thought, evil is the absence of balance, the deliberate embrace of chaos. The Skinwalker is not cursed by fate or trapped by some external power. They are a human being who chooses to abandon Hosho and live in Hojko. That choice makes them terrifying. It also makes them a lesson about the importance of protecting harmony at all costs. Think of the contrast again. A healer gives their life to the study of songs and ceremonies so that they can restore balance for others. They are respected, relied upon, and cherished because they carry the community's survival in their memory. A Skinwalker does the opposite. They take the same knowledge and wield it as a weapon, not to heal but to harm, not to unite but to divide. They are feared not because they are beasts, but because they are people who deliberately turn sacred power inside out. This inversion of healer into destroyer is one of the reasons the Skinwalker continues to haunt the imagination. It speaks to a universal fear, that knowledge itself can be corrupted, that wisdom can be twisted, that those who should protect us might turn against us. The betrayal is not only personal, it is cosmic. It undermines the order of the world itself. That is why even speaking of it requires caution. The figure represents more than horror. It represents the collapse of everything that makes life livable. So when we talk about the Skinwalker, we are not just talking about a shapeshifter or a monster. We are talking about the embodiment of imbalance, the rejection of Hosho. We are talking about the shadow that follows the light of harmony, the reminder that every value can be inverted, every bond can be broken. It is this depth that makes the figure so frightening, far beyond anything shown in pop culture. It is not simply a creature of the night. It is a human choice to embrace chaos, and that is what makes it unforgettable. The stories of Skinwalkers are unsettling not just because of what they describe, but because of how they are told. They are rarely spoken of in the open. They linger in the silences, in the things not said, in the way a voice lowers when the subject is approached. This silence has its own weight. It tells you that the fear is real, that the subject is too dangerous to treat casually. Outsiders often misinterpret this silence as secrecy or superstition, but within the culture it is part of survival. Words have power. Speaking of certain things can draw their attention. Avoiding the subject becomes a form of protection. And yet, stories still surface. They are not always told in full, but fragments are shared, pieces of experiences that reveal the kind of fear Skinwalkers inspire. Often these are not dramatic confrontations but subtle, almost mundane moments that take on a darker shape. A knock at the window in the middle of the night. A figure glimpsed on the edge of vision that vanishes when approached. An animal that seems to move in a way no animal should. These details are small, but they are the ones that leave people shaken. They make the ordinary world unreliable. There are accounts of people hearing their names called out in the darkness, the voice uncannily familiar, as though spoken by someone they know well, but when they search, no one is there. That experience is terrifying not because of what is seen but because of what is felt. The voice was too real, too personal. It pierced through the rational defenses, leaving the person unable to explain what happened. That sense of uncertainty lingers long after the sound has faded. It makes the victim question what is safe, what is trustworthy, what can be believed. Others tell of Skinwalkers appearing as large animals, wolves or coyotes that do not act like the creatures they resemble. Shots fired at them seem to do nothing, and when they finally vanish, footprints of a human are found in the dirt. These kinds of stories are repeated often, but what matters is not whether they can be proven. What matters is how they make people feel. They reinforce the idea that the skinwalker is not bound by ordinary rules, that they can blur the line between human and animal, between natural and unnatural. These accounts also emphasize the personal nature of the attacks. Unlike random monsters in other traditions, skinwalkers are described as targeting specific individuals. Their actions are not accidents of rage. They are acts of intent. A skinwalker does not simply attack the first person they see. They choose a victim based on grudges, jealousy, or rivalry. That makes the fear even more personal. It is not just the possibility of running into something frightening in the wilderness. It is the knowledge that someone may have chosen you, specifically, as their target. Imagine the effect this has on a community. Every misfortune becomes suspect: a sudden illness in a child, a series of unexplained accidents, livestock that die in strange ways. These events may have natural causes, but the fear that they are linked to witchcraft creates tension and suspicion. People begin to look at each other differently, to wonder who might harbor hidden intentions. The social fabric stretches under the strain, harmony frays, and once mistrust has taken root, it can be just as damaging as the acts themselves. The silence around these stories is also what makes them so haunting. Because people avoid speaking of skinwalkers, the fragments that do slip through feel even heavier. A story told in whispers carries more weight than one shouted in public. The very act of telling signals danger. It makes the listener lean in, uncertain whether they want to hear more but unable to turn away. The atmosphere of taboo wraps the story in dread, so that even if the details are simple, the impact is lasting. It is also important to note that these stories are not meant as entertainment. They are not told for fun around campfires. They are warnings, reminders of the consequences of betrayal, of the dangers of imbalance. To treat them as simple, scary tales is to miss their purpose. They carry lessons about values, about the importance of maintaining hozho, about the dangers of selfishness and malice. The fear is real, but it is meant to reinforce community bonds, to show why harmony must be preserved. Outsiders often take these fragments and reshape them into ghost stories or internet legends. They add dramatic flourishes, glowing eyes, monstrous features, cinematic confrontations. These versions spread quickly because they are entertaining, but they distort the truth. The real power of the skinwalker story is not in the spectacle. It is in the quiet dread, in the way small details erode the sense of safety. It is in the silence, in the avoidance, in the heavy weight of what cannot be said. That is far more frightening than any special effect. The persistence of these stories shows how deeply the figure is rooted in the imagination. Even with the taboo, or perhaps because of it, the stories endure. They are passed carefully, cautiously, sometimes only hinted at. The fear does not fade because it is not based only on what is seen. It is based on what is believed, on what is felt in the pit of the stomach when something ordinary turns strange. That kind of fear does not need proof, it needs only possibility. This is what makes the skinwalker so different from other monsters. It does not rely on grand displays or obvious violence. Its power is in the uncertainty it creates. You cannot be sure what you heard, what you saw, what you felt. You question your senses, your memories, your own judgment. That erosion of trust is the true weapon. Once doubt has been planted, it grows on its own. The victim begins to fill in the gaps, to imagine possibilities, to carry the fear forward even without further evidence. That is a far more effective form of terror than any single act of violence. And so, when you hear these stories, the details may vary, but the pattern is clear. A sound in the night, a figure that vanishes, an animal that feels wrong, a voice that should not be there. Each story leaves behind not just a chill but a question. Was it real? Was it a trick? Was it something more? That lingering uncertainty is the mark of the skinwalker. It is not just a monster you encounter once. It is a possibility that lingers in the back of your mind, reshaping how you see the world around you. The contrast between healers and skinwalkers is one of the most important ways to understand why this subject carries so much weight. Both paths involve knowledge, discipline, and study. Both involve a relationship with ceremony, with song, with the unseen forces of the world. But the intentions behind them could not be more opposite. A healer devotes their life to preserving balance. A skinwalker devotes theirs to destroying it. The figure of the healer is essential to Navajo life, because they are the ones who protect Hosho, the harmony that makes everything whole. To see this clearly, you have to understand what a healer does. Known as Hatali, they are singers or chanters who carry immense responsibility. Their training begins early, often guided by older family members or mentors. They memorize vast collections of stories, songs, and prayers. These are not just words but carefully ordered sequences that must be recited perfectly. A single ceremony can last days, requiring thousands of lines to be performed without mistake. The healer must also learn the use of plants, minerals, and sacred objects. They must understand how to diagnose imbalance and how to restore it. Their role is at once that of physician, priest, and psychologist. When someone falls ill, or when misfortune continues to strike a family, the healer is the one who is called. Their first task is to diagnose the cause of the imbalance. Sometimes the cause is physical. Sometimes it is a transgression against natural law. Sometimes it is believed to be the result of witchcraft. The healer has ways of uncovering the truth, including divination practices such as hand trembling or stargazing. Once the source is known, they prescribe the appropriate ceremony, which is called a sing. A sing is more than a ritual. It is a communal act of restoration. The healer leads it, but the family and community participate. They prepare the space, often a hogan, and create sand paintings with colored sands, pollen, and minerals. These paintings are not simply art. They are living representations of sacred stories, temporary portals that invite divine power into the ceremony. The healer chants, sings, and performs rituals to reorient the patient to the order of the universe. Herbal medicines may be given for the body. Stories are retold to heal the mind. The entire event is designed to restore Hosho. Now consider the skinwalker. They too know songs and ceremonies, but they use them in reverse. Where the healer sings to create beauty, the skinwalker sings to create ugliness. Where the healer uses herbs to heal, the skinwalker corrupts them into poisons. Where the healer restores balance, the skinwalker brings imbalance. The same tools are present, but the intent is twisted. This inversion is what makes the skinwalker so frightening. It is not just a monster of superstition. It is a human being who has taken sacred knowledge meant for good and weaponized it for harm. This betrayal is not only personal but cosmic. The healer is a pillar of the community, someone who holds wisdom and uses it selflessly. To see that same wisdom used for selfish or malicious purposes is deeply unsettling. It means that knowledge itself is not inherently good. It depends entirely on the heart of the person who holds it. That truth is uncomfortable because it suggests that anyone, given the same training, could choose to walk the darker path. The skinwalker embodies that possibility. They are not outsiders. They are insiders who chose betrayal. The ceremonies of healing are immense undertakings. They require perfect precision. A healer may spend years learning a single ceremony before they are ready to perform it. To imagine those ceremonies reversed, turned inside out, is to imagine the deepest violation of cultural order. It is not just one person harmed. It is the very structure of Hosho being targeted. That is why the stories describe skinwalkers as dangerous not only to individuals but to entire communities. Their actions spread fear, mistrust, and disorder, unraveling the ties that hold life together. Think of the healer's role in terms of balance. They are constantly working to repair what is broken, to remind people of their place in the cosmos, to maintain right relations with family, community, and land. Their songs are acts of creation. Their ceremonies are bridges between the human and the sacred. They embody wisdom, memory, and responsibility. The skinwalker is the opposite. Their acts are of destruction. Their songs tear down instead of build up. Their ceremonies are parodies meant to wound. They embody betrayal, selfishness, and cruelty. This opposition gives the skinwalker much of its power as a symbol. It is the mirror image of the healer, the reflection of what happens when everything sacred is inverted. The fear of the skinwalker is sharpened by the respect for healers. Because people know how powerful and essential the healer's role is, they also know how terrible it would be to see that role corrupted. It is not difficult to understand why this figure would inspire such dread. Imagine a doctor using their skills not to save but to kill, a priest using their knowledge not to bless but to curse, a storyteller using their tales not to inspire but to break spirits. That is what the Skinwalker represents. It is the healer's shadow, the path of knowledge turned against the very people it was meant to protect. This contrast also helps explain why Skinwalkers are associated with betrayal of kinship. The healer reinforces bonds, ensuring that family ties are strong and supportive. The Skinwalker severs those ties, beginning with acts that symbolically or literally break family bonds. To poison a relative, to murder a sibling, to use kinship as the foundation of power rather than of love, these are the ultimate betrayals. They show that the Skinwalker is not simply rejecting harmony but actively working against it. The healer and the Skinwalker are opposites, but they begin from the same place. That makes the betrayal even more chilling. For those outside the culture, it may be easy to reduce this to a simple dichotomy of good and evil, but for those within, the meaning is far deeper. It is about the choices people make, the paths they walk, the ways they use their knowledge. The healer is revered not only because of their skills, but because of their moral commitment. The Skinwalker is feared not only because of their powers, but because of their decision to abandon that commitment. This is not a battle between equal forces of light and dark, it is a lesson about human responsibility. When you hear about healers and Skinwalkers together, you are not just hearing about folklore, you are hearing about a worldview that values balance above all else. The healer protects that balance. The Skinwalker destroys it. The opposition between them is not entertainment. It is a reflection of how fragile harmony can be, and how devastating it is when someone chooses to betray it. That is why the figure of the Skinwalker remains so powerful, and why the role of the healer remains so respected. They are two sides of the same knowledge, divided entirely by intent, one preserving life and the other unraveling it. When outsiders take an interest in Skinwalker lore, they often do so through the lens of entertainment. They come to it looking for a spooky story, a frightening image, something that will thrill them late at night. But the reality is that this subject cannot be treated that way without doing harm. For the Navajo, speaking of Skinwalkers is taboo. It is avoided for reasons that are not just cultural but spiritual. To talk about them too openly is to risk drawing attention, and that alone makes it clear how serious the matter is. So when the internet and popular media strip away that seriousness and replace it with horror tropes, it does not simply misinform, it disrespects the very people for whom the subject is real and dangerous. The explosion of internet stories about Skinwalkers has only made this problem worse. Videos, articles, and endless posts repeat the same handful of cliches. They describe glowing eyes on dark roads, distorted voices calling out from the night, tall figures crouched in the woods. These details are repeated so often that they create a standardized image, a kind of template monster. Anyone who has spent time online has probably seen this image, and because it is so common, it begins to feel authoritative. But it is not authentic. It is a composite built from fragments of truth mixed with exaggeration, stripped of cultural context. This flattening of the Skinwalker into a mere monster has consequences. It turns something sacred and frightening into a commodity, something that can be sold in movies, on television, or in paranormal tourism. The meaning is lost. The figure becomes just another entry on a list of cryptids, mentioned in the same breath as Mothmen and lake creatures. For the people whose culture holds the original belief, this is deeply frustrating. It is not only inaccurate, it is dangerous. Because while outsiders may treat it as a story, insiders know that words have power. Misusing them is not harmless. The use of the Skinwalker in entertainment also distorts the public perception of indigenous cultures. When most people only encounter Navajo beliefs through sensationalized horror stories, they are left with a picture that is incomplete and misleading. They see the culture as mysterious, dark, and frightening, rather than as a rich and complex worldview centered on harmony, kinship, and balance. The focus on the taboo overshadows the emphasis on healing. The result is that one of the most important aspects of Navajo life is buried under layers of distortion. There is a responsibility that comes with telling stories, especially stories that do not belong to you. To speak about skinwalkers without context is to risk reinforcing stereotypes and spreading misinformation. To repeat the internet's version is to help erase the truth. This is why many voices within indigenous communities ask outsiders to approach the subject with care or to avoid it altogether. It is not that the subject is forbidden to everyone, but that it requires respect, an understanding that it is not just a piece of folklore but a living part of a culture's spiritual framework. Respectful portrayal means acknowledging the limits of what can be known. It means resisting the urge to fill silences with invention. It means admitting that some details are not meant to be shared outside the community, and that what is not spoken is just as important as what is. Outsiders are often uncomfortable with silence, but in this case silence is part of the meaning. To leave space is to recognize that not everything is ours to hold. It also means focusing on what the figure represents rather than treating it as a spectacle. The Skinwalker is a lesson about betrayal, about imbalance, about the dangers of selfishness. To reduce it to glowing eyes in the woods is to miss the point entirely. A respectful approach asks what the story teaches, not just how it can be dramatized. It asks how the figure reflects the values of the culture, not how it can be turned into the next viral post. The need for careful handling becomes even clearer when you consider how easily misinformation spreads. A single exaggerated story can travel across the internet in minutes, repeated thousands of times, until it begins to look like fact. Each repetition takes it further from its origin, until what remains is unrecognizable. This is how the internet's skinwalker came to overshadow the traditional one. And once the distortion has spread, correcting it becomes almost impossible. The caricature is louder than the truth. But truth matters. It matters because it honors the people who carry the original stories. It matters because it preserves meaning. It matters because without it, the lesson is lost. To say that the skinwalker is only a monster is to erase the warning it carries about human choice and betrayal. It is to ignore the cultural emphasis on harmony, on balance, on community. It is to turn something profound into something hollow. There are ways to push back against this. One is by retelling the stories with their context intact, by explaining how the figure fits into a larger worldview. Another is by emphasizing the role of healers, showing that the culture is not defined only by its taboos but also by its practices of restoration and balance. Another is by resisting the urge to sensationalize, by choosing to tell the truth even when it is quieter and less dramatic than what sells. Ultimately, the ethical question is this: when we speak of skinwalkers, are we honoring the culture that holds the belief, or are we exploiting it for entertainment? The answer depends on the choices we make as storytellers, researchers, and listeners. It depends on whether we approach with respect, or whether we take what is not ours and reshape it into something it was never meant to be. The skinwalker itself is about choices. It is about a person who chose to abandon harmony for power. The way we talk about skinwalkers also comes down to choices. We can choose to treat it as just another monster, or we can choose to recognize its depth. We can choose to repeat distortions, or we can choose to preserve the truth. Those choices matter because stories are not harmless. They shape how people see, how they understand, how they respect or disrespect cultures not their own. So when we look at the way skinwalker stories have been handled in popular media, it is worth asking what has been lost. The horror of betrayal has been replaced with cheap scares. The silence of taboo has been filled with noise. The sacred has been turned into spectacle. To correct that, we must be willing to slow down, to listen carefully, to acknowledge what is not ours to retell. That may not make for the flashiest story, but it makes for an honest one. And honesty is the only way to treat a subject like this with the gravity it deserves. To ignore that responsibility is to become complicit in the very kind of distortion that the figure itself warns against. Betrayal comes in many forms. One of them is the betrayal of truth. If the skinwalker is a lesson about betrayal, then we should be careful not to repeat that betrayal in the way we speak about it. Respect requires nothing less. By now it should be clear that the figure of the skinwalker cannot be reduced to a simple monster story. It is not just another frightening tale to add to the list of global legends. It is something much deeper, bound to a culture, to a worldview, to a way of life, To understand it is to recognize that it is not only about fear but about meaning. The Skinwalker is terrifying because it embodies betrayal, imbalance, and the deliberate rejection of harmony. It is not an outside beast. It is a human choice turned against community. We have traced the Skinwalker from its distorted image in popular culture back to its roots in Navajo tradition. Along the way, we have seen how it differs from the familiar figure of the werewolf, how it emerges not from tragedy, but from intent. We have explored how the path to becoming one requires acts that sever the deepest bonds of kinship, culminating in betrayal so profound that it breaks the very structure of Hosho. We have looked at the way it takes the knowledge of healers and inverts it, turning tools of healing into weapons of destruction. We have examined how its presence creates fear not only through direct harm but through the erosion of trust, the slow dismantling of safety, the whispering doubt that lingers in silence. We have also seen how outsiders have reshaped the Skinwalker into something it was never meant to be. Internet stories and television shows have turned it into a stock monster, a glowing-eyed beast in the desert, a character in the theater of paranormal entertainment. This version spreads quickly, but it strips away the meaning. It erases the cultural context, the values, the warnings, the lessons. What remains is a hollow echo, a caricature that bears little resemblance to the authentic figure. And yet the popularity of that echo shows how hungry people are for mystery, even if they do not realize what they are sacrificing in the process. To end this exploration, we must return to the foundation of Navajo life, Hosho. This idea of balance, harmony, and beauty is not just an ideal. It is the lifeway that sustains individuals and communities. It is preserved through right thinking, right speaking, and right action. Every act of generosity, every prayer, every respectful interaction is part of maintaining it. Illness, misfortune, and conflict are seen as signs that Hosho has been disturbed. The role of the healer is to restore it. The Skinwalker, by contrast, is a deliberate assault upon it. That is the essence of its horror. It is not just about one person's suffering, it is about the unraveling of the order that holds everything together. This is why the figure continues to command fear and respect. Even if outsiders misunderstand it, even if it is trivialized into entertainment, within the culture it remains a taboo subject, avoided for reasons both practical and spiritual. The fear is not theatrical. It is lived, it shapes behavior, it shapes silence, it shapes the way people think about harmony and betrayal. And it endures because the lesson it carries is timeless, that the greatest danger does not always come from the outside, but from within. The story of the Skinwalker teaches that knowledge itself is neutral, and that what matters is how it is used. The same songs can heal or harm, the same plants can save or poison. The same bonds of kinship can sustain life or be broken for selfish gain. The difference is intent. The healer chooses selflessness, the Skinwalker chooses betrayal. That choice makes all the difference. And that is why the Skinwalker is not just frightening but profoundly meaningful. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that human beings are capable of choosing destruction, even when they know exactly what they are doing. It also reminds us of the fragility of trust. Communities are built on bonds of kinship, on shared values, on mutual care. When those bonds are broken, the damage spreads far beyond one act. Suspicion grows, harmony unravels, fear lingers. The Skinwalker represents that unraveling, magnified to its most terrifying form. But by doing so, it also highlights why protecting harmony matters. The existence of the figure is a warning, a reminder that Hosho must be preserved through daily acts, through constant vigilance, through respect for the sacred. For outsiders listening to these stories, the responsibility is clear. To repeat them without context is to distort them. To sensationalize them is to disrespect them. But to approach them carefully, to recognize their weight, to listen with humility, is to honor the culture they come from. That may mean accepting that some silences cannot be filled, that some knowledge is not ours to hold. It may mean focusing on what the figure represents rather than on lurid details. It may mean resisting the urge to make it into entertainment. Respect begins with restraint. And so, as this exploration comes to a close, what remains is not just fear but understanding. The Skinwalker is not a tale of glowing eyes on back roads. It is not a creature waiting in the shadows of Utah ranches. It is a story about human choices, about the fragility of harmony, about the destructive power of betrayal. It is a reminder of how vital it is to preserve balance, to honor kinship, to value community. It is a figure that frightens not because it is strange, but because it is familiar. It is human. And that is what makes it endure. Every culture has its warnings. Every community tells stories that remind people of what must be preserved. For the Navajo, the Skinwalker is one of those stories. It is not meant to entertain. It is meant to teach, to caution, to reinforce the values that hold life together. To speak of it is to walk a dangerous line, because even naming it carries risk. But to acknowledge it is also to acknowledge the seriousness of betrayal, the weight of imbalance, the danger of choosing ugliness over beauty. The lesson, then, is simple but profound. Harmony must be protected, kinship must be honored, knowledge must be used for healing, not for harm. The Skinwalker shows what happens when those responsibilities are abandoned. It is the shadow that falls when balance is broken. It is the reminder that evil is not always a beast outside the door, but sometimes a choice made by the people closest to us. That is why the story endures. That is why it still inspires fear. And that is why it should be treated with respect. As we close, remember that the Skinwalker is not just another monster. It is a mirror. It reflects the darkest potential of human choice, the consequences of betrayal, the collapse of harmony. But in seeing that mirror, we are also reminded of the opposite, the importance of balance, of beauty, of community. The story warns us of what we must avoid, and by doing so it teaches us what we must cherish. That is its power, that is its meaning, and that is where this exploration must end.